The Mandalorian, Chapter 6. Hello and welcome to another Postmortem discussion of the Hoeg YouTube channel. This time about The Mandalorian, Chapter 6, subtitled The Prisoner. And if you're not familiar with the Postmortem format here at the channel, this is going to be a spoiler-filled episode. We have seen Chapter 6. We are going to discuss it. We are going to digest it. We're going to analyze it, hopefully in an illuminating way, but you never know when we talk about these things. And if you haven't seen the episode and you want to go into it unblemished, please go check it out and then come back here and talk about it with us in the comments to this video. I love having discussions about these things. So in this episode, I think, just like last week when we talked about the fact that The Mandalorian had slowly but surely become a kind of episodic adventure series. I likened it to a Saturday morning cartoon. That might be a little bit ungenerous, but overall, it really harkens back to a time in television that we don't see of that much anymore. Television has really become much more serialized with plot lines that go through and through and through. And I think to some extent, The Mandalorian itself kind of played a little game with us. The first 3 episodes, as we've talked about in the past, really represented a very serialized story. Now, Chapter 2 was a little bit of filler that maybe could have been pulled out pretty easily, and maybe that should have been a warning to us. But overall, the first 3 episodes tell a story in a kind of movie-like format and suggested, at least to me, that we would be watching a serialized television show. Now, some of that is brought to the table by me, by the audience members, who are now used to watching serialized television very often. But I think a lot of it is also on the creators of the show. They knew how this would be portrayed after the first 3 episodes. And now we find ourselves 3 episodes later, and essentially I think the format of The Mandalorian has come to the fore. Now we see that it is essentially going to be an episodic television program. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's awful, it's terrible, it's not worth watching. I don't think it necessarily has the same kind of pull as a really well-orchestrated, serialized program. But as an episodic television program, it does give certain ability for the showrunners and various directors and producers and writers to get in there, have a little bit of fun in the universe, and then get out. There are good shows still on that have a certain episodic quality. But overall, I think it's a surprise that this big $100 million effort to put Star Wars on the small screen for the first time is so unambitious. This episode really did have a beginning and an end where if you took it out completely from the adventure and you had the Mandalorian hyperspacing into wherever he's going to land at the start of Chapter 7, you probably don't miss much, if anything, in Chapter 6. And that's been the case with Chapter 6, that's been the case with 5, with 4. And at the end of the day, I think what it does do is say, hey, if you miss an episode, you can come, you can check it out, that's great. But you don't have this kind of strong pull to making sure that you don't miss a Mandalorian episode. I think at the very start, Disney caught a little something by the tail and actually had a show that everybody was talking about, that people were excited to follow the next week. And they had this kind of zeitgeist moment. And it wouldn't surprise me. I'm not on the internet kind of talking about these things very often. It's been a very busy month. Year end at a law firm always is. It wouldn't surprise me if over the internet there are people saying, yeah, okay, it's fine or it's not fine, depending on how they feel about a given episode, but I don't necessarily need to see it. It's the Mandalorian and the Yoda baby, and they arrive at a new planet, or they arrive at a space station, as is the case in this episode, and some stuff happens. There's an adventure. It's either good or it's not, and then they go about their business. And yeah, that's exactly what happens. This is the kind of show that maybe in the 90s or even the early 2000s, you would have had a narrator giving a 2-minute kind of synopsis of what has happened, not like we think of with it previously on, but just the Mandalorian and the Yoda baby find themselves in a galaxy far, far away, etc., and just kind of giving the setup for why these 2 characters are in a ship and going from place to place. And it wouldn't surprise me if they did that in season 2, as far as this goes right now. So I'm left kind of in a similar situation as I was at the end of episode 5. Now, I will tell you, I found this episode to be significantly worse than the last episode. And that last episode, if you missed my analysis of that I gave, I actually found that to be very, very cheesy. It was very much, hey, remember Tatooine, very video game cutscene-y in terms of execution and overall cheese factor. And unfortunately, what this episode did was it had that same kind of video game cutscene quality of very, very cheesy, especially when you're initially meeting the heist crew. And instead of in Chapter 5, where it had a very light story, it was very short in running time, this one has an extended running time with maybe even less story. And that's always a pretty good way to irritate me. Not that I need you to move ultra fast through your plot, but if you're going to have such a slight story, maybe you don't have the longest running time of maybe any episode in the series right now. I think this is the only episode that has a 43-minute type running time shown on Disney Plus. Now that even isn't completely accurate because you've got the end credits, you've got the front previously on, but I do think this is longer than some of the other Mandalorian episodes that they've put out there, and it just doesn't have much going on. Like the other episodes where we've discussed this, we're going to go through the scenes and highlight some of the things that I picked out, but overall, it's a very, very simple story, just like the stories in the past couple of chapters. Ultimately, I think it's going to be up to each person to say whether or not this is working for them. But at some level, I look at this and say, this is actually kind of a dumb show. It kind of got pretty bad pretty quickly. And The Mandalorian chapters 1 through 3 is essentially a different product than what we have got and what we are likely to get in the future in these later chapters. And I think really the best case scenario for something like this is adopting a kind of either Farscape model. If you're not familiar with that show, that was a science fiction show that was largely episodic, but they did some cool stuff in their end of season kind of finales or three-parters or what have you, where the various episodic adventures that the crew got into would have some impact. They would go and they would get the allies that they met in episodes 2 and 6 and 8, and they would be involved in the plot in the finale or near finale. And you can see that there is a possibility for that kind of structure in The Mandalorian. You have little snippets that could be used for a purpose like that. You've got the Bounty Hunter Guild leader alive somewhere. You've got from the last episode the fact that that bounty hunting target had somebody kneel over them right at the end of the episode, indicating that they might be setting up some kind of way of using these episodic elements in a way that will work as a finale and hopefully in some kind of satisfying fashion. In this episode alone, you've basically got the crew that survived being imprisoned by the Mandalorian that could show up at a later point in time, could be useful in a finale kind of scenario. You also see this outside of Farscape in, I think, the more popular Doctor Who series, where you've got a kind of long-running plot line that's all behind the scenes of these kind of episodic adventures, and that really takes the fore, usually in the pilot and either in the midpoint or in the finale of the series. You could have a scenario like that. I don't know whether The Mandalorian is that ambitious. I think at some point they are going to have to address the overall kind of Yoda baby situation, come back to the fact that he was taken by the Mandalorian, and we don't know exactly why the Imperials were looking for him. We don't know exactly what the Yoda baby even is or where it came from. We might get some background on that. We might not. If we're talking about a Saturday morning adventure cartoon, those are the kinds of questions that they tease out in little tiny snippets in episode 33 of season 4. And you have to really follow the thing to even try to get a little bit of forward momentum on the overall plot, because at the end of the day, they really don't want to upturn the apple cart. They really don't want to change the state of play. They want you to be able to jump in at any time, which really doesn't make a ton of sense for a platform like Disney Plus, right? You have access to every episode immediately. You can watch them in the order that they were created and that they were aired. When you talk about episodic television, it can still make sense in parts on broadcast TV. You see it in procedurals like lawyer shows or cop shows or doctor shows. You see them have those elements, but on a service like this where you have full access to the series at all times, it doesn't make a ton of sense, but that certainly isn't stopping Disney from doing it. So in this episode, we're going to dive in right now, but overall, I think we have to get used to it being episodic. if it continues down this path and it doesn't kind of have a significant plot element towards the end of the season, I would doubt very much that this is the kind of thing I would cover in postmortems for season 2 and onwards. So I think we're going to go through this season. We're going to try to figure out exactly what this show is, just like they're trying to figure out what this show is. And if it's just a episodic piece of television, like an Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. for the most part, even though it got more serialized certainly as it went along, if it's just episodic TV, pretty unambitious, and delivering regularly video game style cutscenes, I don't think it needs necessarily a high level of analysis. But for now, for this episode, let's dive in. So this episode starts with the Mandalorian landing on what appears to be an old buddy's space station by the name of Ran. And like so many kind of shady looking characters called Ran, he's putting together a crew for a heist. Now, if you know me, you know that I really do like heist movies. I like heist concepts. There's a couple of Star Wars books before Disney took over that had a heist concept involved in them, and I like those kinds of things. But it was clear just from that setup that this was very likely to be another episodic adventure. The Mandalorian joins a heist. And as it turns out, Ran, the Mando's buddy on the space station, actually needs the Razor Crest, his ship, more than the Mandalorian himself. He used to run with this crew, the Mandalorian did, so the episode seems to be intimating a certain amount of shadiness in his past, just to give his character a little bit of color, because now, 6 episodes into an 8-episode run, gotta be honest, we don't actually know a lot about the Mandalorian. I had hoped to have his character be expounded upon at some point in the show, and it might still be a little bit, maybe in the finale, but we really don't have that kind of growth arc that I would have hoped for. It's essentially just a known product at this point. He is a silent gunslinger, and he's going to get into fights. Then we're introduced to the crew that Ran has put together to steal a prisoner from what turns out to be a New Republic prisoner ship. You've got a bald human named Mayfeld that runs point. He makes a stormtrooper aiming joke, along with a number of other references designed to kind of tell you that you're in the Star Wars universe. There's a Canto Bight reference. He uses the term Gungan to question what the Mandalorian looks like under his helmet. He is the one-stop shop for Star Wars references throughout the episode. The rest of the crew is Berg, a Deveronian. He's the muscle, the big devil-looking guy. I have to admit, while this did look like a video game cutscene, it was nice to see the kind of more on-the-nose, kind of Halloween costume store aliens that you were so regularly seeing in the 1977 version of Star Wars, and that has gone away a little bit in the Disney sequel trilogy. They seem to be avoiding some of those kind of masked aliens and some of the more ridiculous-looking approaches. So it was nice to see him. You've got a droid named Zero, a kind of bug-eyed droid that's going to be the pilot of the ship. And then you've got a Twi'lek named Xi'an, who apparently has some kind of significant past with the Mandalorian. They used to run in the crew together, and that's kind of the mystery of what that relationship might be. I'll tell you right now, you don't actually learn much more about that relationship through the episode, so it remains a mystery, and maybe one to be solved in an episode that's dedicated to that relationship at some point in the future. Who knows? But that's the crew. Like I said, these scenes tend to have a fairly video game cutscene quality to them, a lot of which is related to the fact that the makeup maybe isn't as great as you might see in films or in cinema. And it maybe is the fact that the Twi'leks and the Deveronians are a little bit more traditional 1970s alien-esque. And one thing I will say about this episode is it did kind of have a look of an old Flash Gordon, or something like a really serialized TV show that had that kind of old school look, which I thought, while it didn't exactly fit 100% with Star Wars, it did kind of harken back to what George Lucas was looking at as his inspiration for Star Wars. So I really didn't mind it that much, but it certainly was a kind of different approach to how these things look. Then they get on the ship, they're going on the mission, they have a talk with the group. You have a kind of group of somewhat angry, hard to deal with people that have their own specialities. There's a fight about whether or not the Mandalorian will take off his helmet. And in that fight, the Baby Yoda is exposed. There's some threatening behavior that Mayfeld takes with Baby Yoda. And it's an interesting beat, at least in the episode, where you see the Mandalorian trying to decide essentially whether or not he's going to have to hit this guy or fire at him or threaten him, and trying to go all the way to the edge of the line so that he doesn't give away how important the Yoda baby is to him. even though we don't 100% understand exactly why this particular creature is that important to the Mandalorian, other than the fact that he appears to have some sympathy or empathy for orphaned or lost creatures in the universe. Outside of that, we still don't have a great reason for that bond, and I suspect we're not ever going to get one. Then the ship comes out of hyperspace. They do some weird maneuvers in order to stay in the cruiser's blind spot. I'm not sure it really looks very likely to work in that fashion. They kind of skid out of hyperspace, and there they are. It seemed a little bit difficult to believe for me just watching that it would be enough to avoid the sensors of this spaceship, but it's not really important to the plot. We can just assume that if they didn't do that, they would have had some other kind of magical who's it or what's it. So I'm not going to hold that against it. I can suspend my disbelief, but it did jump out at me when it happened that it didn't look like something that the ship sensors wouldn't be able to understand, but there we go. Then they commence the heist. The group goes past some prisoners. They meet a mouse droid. Like I said, the look is very Flash Gordon. And the Mandalorian winds up fighting all these robots that come after them. He's got cool gadgets. He does some cool moves. It's a nice fight. It's a good-looking fight. And it was at this point in the episode that I was watching, and I was thinking, the Mandalorian actually reminds me of a couple of different shows that I sometimes watch that are really more about cool fights, potentially cool cinematography, money on the screen, than the plot itself. And in this particular case, I was reminded of a show called Into the Badlands, which I've only watched, I think, one season of. I think it's got multiple seasons. But ultimately, this show is about cool fights more than it is about interesting plots or deep characterization. And I thought that very distinctly while I was watching The Mandalorian have this fight and while I was thinking about the episode and how light it was. And yeah, that fight looked cool. And there are a number of other fights that look cool in this episode, but that's all it is. And so they then proceed on. You have them have a standoff with a rebel trooper. As it turns out, there's a human on board. It was only supposed to be droids, where they again reference that the Mandalorian hates droids. And this particular Republic trooper has a beacon that is supposed to call, I think, the New Republic police in X-Wings to come and rescue him, attack him, solve his issue. Whatever it might be, it becomes a little bit unclear when you get to the end of the episode, but we'll talk about that then. The scene itself kind of devolves into verging on parody, with the crew kind of having jokes amongst themselves. Xi'an says Mayfeld is making things worse, and he essentially turns his guns on her and says, "Are you questioning my managerial style?" in a very kind of satirical way. It comes across rather funny. And some of that might be that I think this character, and I don't know this for sure, is played by the actor that is Anakin in the Clone Wars. I want to say Matt Latner or something along those lines. And he has a kind of somewhat funny face. He looks like a little bit comedic in this role. And so the entire scene has this kind of patina of being almost comedic, satirical, or a parody of Star Wars, which isn't a great thing because this is supposed to be a very serious kind of standoff-esque scene. But it is what it is. Xi'an kills him, the beacon goes off, and now we get a timer. They have 20 minutes to solve their issues, whatever they might be, to get their prisoner that they are trying to rescue, and to get off the ship. One thing I would point out here as we go and we talk about the adventures that happen on the ship now from this point on is that they never kind of reestablish the alarm scenario. They have set up this ticking timer, which is good. It's a good thing. It's a good thing to create suspense. And they never really go back to that. There's no voice that says, 15 minutes or 10 minutes or 5 minutes. There's nothing along those lines. So it kind of fades into the background. You forget about it, which can work for a story like this, and then you're reminded of it right at the end, but you never really are. It's just not a factor in this, even after you get that 20-minute timer. So then they get the prisoner out. He turns out to be Xi'an's brother, Quinn, who says the Mandalorian left him behind. And then the whole crew imprisons the Mandalorian in the same cell that they get Quinn out of. And the question immediately springs to mind, was this always the plan? I think by the time you get to the end of the episode, the Mandalorian is under the understanding that it was always the plan. But it's a little bit unclear in the moment. Were they just taking advantage? Do they just hate the Mandalorian? Are they stealing his ship? We don't really know. And it's at this point that Zero, the droid that was left to kind of pilot the ship, finds the return quarry message that we saw the Mandalorian get at the top of Chapter 3, that he's going to return the Yoda baby to the X-Imperial, and whatever's going to happen is going to happen. Zero finds this message and puts together the dots that say that the Yoda baby is important. And again, the message that he got was return quarry. So remember that, because it doesn't make a ton of sense where this plot goes. The Mandalorian, trapped in his cell, then breaks out of it with a droid arm after another cool kind of gadget-oriented fight that he has with the droid, including a somewhat violent-looking kind of oil spill splatter across his cell door that is clearly evocative of blood coming out. Much like the prequels, the Mandalorian uses droids as enemies to have much more violent action than would be possible with human beings. And to great effect. There's actually some really cool fighting in this episode, if that's what you're looking for out of an episode like this. The Mandalorian finds himself in the control room. He puts red lights in all of the halls to add a little bit of dramatic flair, because he is the Batman and he wants to put a little bit of fear into the people that he is now going to be hunting. And you get a certain amount of reminiscence of maybe the Force Awakens, when you had Rey and Finn dealing with a control room and various doors to open and close in their situation with, I think that's the Rat-Thars, with Han Solo and everybody else. But now with red halls, you get a little bit more drama. You get a split of the group, and you have the Mandalorian hunting them down. We'll come back to that in just a second, because at the same time, Zero is now trying to figure out where the Yoda baby is. He's trying to hunt him through the Razor Crest because he now thinks he's important. At this point in time, the groups that have been separated are now being hunted by the Mandalorian. Berg, the Devaronian, the big devil-looking guy, finds the control room where the Mandalorian's in the ceiling. They have a fight. The Mandalorian mostly loses because Berg is big and he's the muscle, but he hits him with a door twice, and it's pretty cool. After that, we see the Mandalorian hunt down the rest of the crew members, finally finishing up with Quinn, who's trying to board the Razor Crest. Quinn turns to the Mandalorian and says, basically, hey, your job was to capture me. I offer myself to you. Aren't you a man of honor? And the scene ends. Then we find out that Zero is continuing to hunt down the Baby Yoda and is about to kill the Baby Yoda, which again doesn't make a ton of sense from the information that we know that Zero has, which is that he knows the Bounty Hunters Guild had talked to the Mandalorian about returning with Quarry, and so he decides he's going to hunt and kill the Baby Yoda. Now, we know the Baby Yoda is important. We also know from the beginning of the series that at least the ex-Imperial was willing to take the Baby Yoda dead, but nothing in the message that we know of that the droid would have seen, Zero would have seen, would indicate that you should hunt and kill this Yoda baby at this point in time. But it's at this time that we see the Yoda baby try to use a little bit of force power on the droid. He blows up, the Yoda baby looks at his hand comically, and we realize that the Mandalorian has come up behind Zero and shot him in the chest. So now all of the crew has been taken care of, and the Mandalorian flies back to Rand's space station, and it turns out that he accepted Quinn's offer to collect him. He turns over Quinn, Rand pays him his money, and the Mandalorian leaves the station just like we would have expected. But the episode doesn't end there. In fact, it's at this point that Rand says, kill him. And a fighter starts coming out of the space station, presumably to hunt down the Mandalorian. And Quinn realizes that something is in his pocket. The Mandalorian has placed the New Republic beacon on Quinn, and X-Wings come out of hyperspace, identify the beacon, realize there's a gunship coming out, and just open fire on everything. Okay, what was that beacon supposed to do? Was that beacon just supposed to have X-Wings come and fire at everything? Were they at all concerned that the beacon moved in hyperspace to a different location while they were supposedly scrambling their fighters to address the situation? Isn't the beacon tied to the fact that it's a prisoner transport? Anyway, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day, but it does seem kind of goofy for whatever it is this is supposed to be. It seems almost like video game logic, that you just have this kind of specific laser-guided something and you can aim X-Wings at it. And it can be at that prison transport, or it can be at the space station that you have indicated you would like to see destroyed. And it doesn't matter whether or not the X-Wings think about it too hard. They're going to destroy whatever that beacon is located at. Fair enough. It's also worth pointing out that Dave Filoni, the director of the Clone Wars and other various animated Star Wars series, as well as the director of 2 episodes of The Mandalorian, is one of the X-Wing pilots. And that is one that I definitely recognize because he has been on so many behind the scenes and various other featurettes talking about his relationship with George Lucas and the animated series in general. So it was nice to see him. He didn't really jump out, certainly not as bad as some of the folks that JJ generally puts in the X-Wings chairs. And that's the end of the episode. The Mandalorian and the Yoda baby fly off into Chapter 7, almost like this never happened. But with a new sack of money that we didn't really get indicated that he desperately needed. He needed money in the last episode to fix his ship. He's needed money in general to live, presumably. But this was just, I'm going to go take a job, and for that job, I'm going to get paid, and we are going to hyperspace in to the next chapter. And that's Chapter 6, The Prisoner. Well, almost. There's one last scene where we are shown that the Mandalorian didn't, in fact, murder everybody on the crew. He instead just imprisoned them on a Republic prison transport, presumably with no beacon and maybe no way for the Republic to ever find them again. It's unclear there, and if that is the case, that would actually probably be worse than murdering them. We're not going to dive too deep into that. I'm going to assume that that prison transport is going to be discovered at some point. At least one or more of those characters are going to pop up in the series again, and everybody will have bygones be bygones and be best friends by the end of whatever that episode might be. Now, that's Chapter 6, The Prisoner, and as we talked about at the start of this analysis, it's essentially just an adventure story with the same beginning as it has an ending, and there's not a lot more to kind of digest there other than the fact that the Mandalorian apparently had a shady past, he ran with some criminals, he hates droids, and he loves that Yoda baby to death, which is all basically things that we pretty much knew going into the episode. So, while I like The Mandalorian, I think it's actually one of the kind of less ambitious things that I'm currently watching, and I don't know that I will keep up with it on a week-to-week basis, certainly after this season, after we get done with this Postmortem series. I wish I would have that inclination. I wish I were excited about where the series was going. If you go and you look at my analysis of Chapter 3, you can hear in my voice at the end of that, wondering what this show is going to be, excited about the possibilities. And while I like kind of bouncing in and seeing some cool shots and seeing Disney put money on the screen from time to time, it really isn't appointment viewing. And in my heart, I wish it was. That's been my postmortem discussion of Mandalorian Chapter 6, The Prisoner. If you liked it, we talk about these kinds of things on the channel all the time. Like, subscribe, check out our stuff. If you caught it on YouTube, thanks for watching. If you listened to it in its podcast form, thank you for listening. And I will catch you on the next postmortem discussion of the Hoeg YouTube channel.